Ashton Marra in Clendenin in Kanawha County, and I'm joined today by the Speaker of the House, Tim Armstead, and Russ Campbell, formerly of the West Virginia Conservation Agency. Thank you both for joining me.
Pleasure.
Mr. Campbell, in the early 2000s, you worked on a plan to mitigate the impact of flooding in West Virginia, and we want to talk about that plan. But I'd like to start first with you, Mr. Speaker, and ask you to tell us, you represent this area of Clendenin and Elkview. You live in Elkview, and you were personally impacted by this storm. Can you tell us a little bit about that impact on your personal life?
Well, Ashton's been, we were fortunate because we did flood. We had about 6.5 feet of water in our home and our family room and storage room and laundry room, but we've been fortunate because we've been able to live in our house, and that's the thing that we do feel very fortunate about, because there are just so many people in Clendenin and Elkview area that are not able to do that, and are either living with family or trying to live in their homes even though they're damaged. And so that's one of the things that we want to certainly continue to concentrate on, is making sure everyone can get into a safe home that they can stay in until we're able to repair their homes.
We're certainly hearing those stories from all parts of the state impacted by the flooding. Mr. Campbell, in 2004, a state task force that you were a member of published a 365-page report focused on mitigating the impacts of flooding in the state, doing things like reducing the unnecessary loss of life, of managing floodplains, of managing land use in West Virginia. It's a comprehensive report that we can't dive deeply into, but I'd like to ask you, at the time that report came out, what were 2 or 3 of the major things that you saw needed to be implemented in the state of West Virginia?
The report is very comprehensive, and a great effort of multiple agencies coming together and expertise from all venues that would bear energy and programs to flood reduction, damage reduction, life-saving programs that could be implemented. And I think probably one of the primary objectives or recommendations that came from the group working together in the task force was to really ensure that flood warnings are adequate, are statewide, are well maintained, are effective, and the residents of the areas would be trained or educated in knowing what those alarms or evacuation notices mean when they are sounded and deployed. And I think there's been a great deal of energy put to that initiative around the state by the Department of Homeland Security Emergency Management, and there's been good progress there. But I think that's probably one of the most primary activities to save lives, is to let people know of the danger and the peril that is pending coming their way, and give them as much advance warning as possible.
Earlier this week, the director of the State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, Jimmy Jeanette, mentioned that as one area that the state really has improved over the past several years. As you watched the state respond to this specific event, is there anything that stuck out to you as they could have done this better, or if they had just watched this plan, we could have avoided this? I'm thinking particularly, there were 23 lives lost across the state, 6 right here in Kanawha County in the Clendenin area. When it comes to that, could we have avoided that loss of life by implementing some of your other recommendations?
Well, the concern I would have, Ashton, is the warning system, any that we have around the state in the various counties, adequate enough during times of power outages, phone line damages? I know that some of the 911 callback centers have notified me when there's a chemical issue down in the southern part of the county, and if there were power outages, will that system enable communication to the landowner, to the resident, at all hours of the day? Will it wake up people who may have hearing impairment? Will it notify people who have physical issues that can't deal with either a hearing or a sound or a knock on the door? I know a friend of mine, his neighbors were beating on the wall of his home. It didn't awaken him, and the waters came up into his home. So that's the kind of issues I think we should revisit, and just make sure that our warning systems, even though they are progressing and have been enhanced, are adequate enough to truly do what we can to save lives. That's the bottom line of all of our energies, is to reduce death and destruction from that.
This report deals a lot with floodplain management. As we look toward rebuilding in these parts of West Virginia impacted by the flood, what can we learn, what can we garner from this report?
How we live with the floodplain is very critical in what we do from here on out. And I know that since the report was first printed, a lot of floodplain management ordinances have been approved across the state in many of the counties, if not in fact possibly all of them. And permitting practices have improved where a structure can be located in relation to the base flood elevation, basically the 100-year floodplain. Those analyses are made by technical folks that say, hey, this is a safe place, this is not as safe, that should not be built there. And we've learned those things and have implemented improvements in those programs. But it's critical that we realize that floods will occur again in West Virginia. This is not the last time we will have an event similar to this, or maybe not to this magnitude in the next recurrence, but floods are a fact of life, and it can be maybe even more dramatic next time or less dramatic. But how we live with the floodplain reconstruction, where we develop the infrastructure, where we put water and sewer lines, power lines, all the utilities that go into place, how we locate bridges, public roads in relation to the base flood elevation is very crucial. When those practices are improved and we allow ourselves then to reduce our threat of loss, and especially the threat to life itself, it's better off for us. And I think West Virginia has made great strides in that.
Mr. Speaker, just a few weeks after the floods, you called on your fellow lawmakers, your fellow state officials, to take a look and review this plan that came out over 12 years ago. What specifically do you see the state either doing or not doing that this plan could help fix?
Well, first of all, I think back, I recall when the plan was drafted and was taken up in some of the committees that I served on at the time, and some of us who represented areas who had had flooding in the past, because some of our areas had previous flooding, had particularly centered in on one thing that we thought was important to do, and that was part of the plan suggested an advisory council of different agencies to be able to really take a continuous look at what could be done to avoid flooding in certain areas, to respond to flooding, as Russ has said, to make sure people were aware of emergencies when they took place. So we really wanted to take that first step, which I think was, initially it wasn't necessarily going to solve any of the problems, but it was going to be able to ensure that we had an ongoing effort to look at the different issues that related to flooding in our state. And so that was a bill that we had introduced back at that time, I believe in 2005, that we had that bill. And it did not get passed, but it was bipartisan support for that. So I think that's one of the first steps, is to try to get a real group that is always looking at ways to address flooding. The technology has changed since that time. The opportunities we have to get the word out have changed. Other opportunities perhaps to look at new technology that might be able to help us avoid the impact of floods. So I think all those things are important for us to look at, and what we've done is we're putting it in the interim committees, which meet almost every month between session. When session ends before the next session, we meet periodically and talk about issues we want to address in the upcoming session. So this has been, Senate President Cole and I have put this in as one of those subjects that we are going to be looking at through our interim process.
Mr. Campbell, you have a very influential person sitting next to you.
Absolutely.
Who says that this is something that they're going to discuss here in the near future. What would you say to the Speaker? What would you say to his fellow lawmakers? What are the most important things for them to know, for them to look for as they make these plans?
I think one of the most important ideas and issues is what the Speaker has mentioned, in getting unity of like an oversight group or an organization that will have outreach to the different agencies and can focus as they see need, using the plan as a strategic guidance document. That the outline and the effort has been laid as a base foundation for a very effective statewide response. And having an organization that can interact and focus on various parts. Many of them are expensive, some are less expensive as far as the recommendations are concerned, but they all can be addressed as the Speaker said, as technology has been revised and enhanced. Many can even be deployed or employed even easier than they could have been 10, 12 years ago. So I think the effect of coming together and being able to carve out pieces that will enhance life in West Virginia, to protect our citizens, to save lives, to be able to notify them when danger is pending. I think the education roles are there for the citizens to be informed of what exists now, to help them during an evacuation, what types of alarms need to be raised to get people's attention, and to make sure that they have all the help that they can to help themselves in their own manner to save their own lives.
And the economic climate that we're currently in, Mr. Speaker, one that's essentially at the center of every decision that state lawmakers make, is there enough interest? Are there enough resources to make these kinds of changes?
Well, first of all, a couple things I'd say is, one, our resources right now are obviously going to be centered around getting people's lives back together, first of all. Making sure people have homes, making sure people are able to get back to work and get their lives back together and get our kids back in school. I mean, that's going to be a real challenge. So there are a lot of challenges that we face economically to move our state forward. But at the same time, I do think we need to always remember that one of the key purposes of government is public safety. That's one of our chief roles. That's one of the most important things that we do. And so we will have to set priorities, and this certainly has to be an important priority, because it is a part of our role as government to do what we can to ensure public safety. And this is, as we've seen, unfortunately, the loss of life that we've seen. We certainly are, our hearts go out to the families of those people who we've lost, and to those who are affected. And I think they expect, and rightfully so, expect us to make it a priority. And yes, funds are limited, but I do think it needs to be placed in the budget, along with all other issues that we have to deal with, in terms of its priority, and it certainly is, in my opinion, a very high priority.
House Speaker Tim Armstead, Mr. Russ Campbell, thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashton.